What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. The first college football playoff rankings will come out tomorrow night. I'm going to project what those rankings will look like. If you followed me over the last 5 or 6 years, I've done this every year, and when these first rankings come out, there have been a lot of years where I've projected the rankings, and a lot of people thought they were crazy, and there's no way they were going to look like this, and then we get the rankings, and they turn out to be super accurate. Then there's been other years where I've been a little off, and it seems like the committee maybe changes their formula from year to year. It is a different group of people, and you're going to get different opinions and different ways of looking at things. I understand that. So no guarantee that these projections are going to be accurate, but I feel pretty confident, and I'll kind of talk about the things I feel confident in and maybe the things that I don't feel as confident in. And so let's just jump right into it. We'll start at the bottom. This is 21 through 25. So I didn't even look at any 3-loss teams, so perhaps there's a 3-loss team that's going to surprise us to be in these rankings, but I didn't really see anything that was worth looking into. It takes a long time to go through and go through all the resumes and list them out and everything. So I didn't look at any 3-loss teams this week. Only 2-loss teams and 1-loss teams and undefeated teams, obviously. And this is what I came up with for the bottom. Let me quickly go through the teams that didn't make it, and I'll tell you why, and then we'll go through these teams. So the other 2-loss teams here were that I considered were North Carolina, Oklahoma State, and Miami. North Carolina with 2 pretty bad losses. Oklahoma State with a really bad loss to South Alabama. Miami, they were probably the next in line. They do have a loss to Georgia Tech. That's not a great loss. Wins over Texas A&M and Clemson. That's about it. So Miami would be the team. If it's not Kansas State at 25, I think Miami would probably be that team. But I'm going to go with the Wildcats, especially the way they've been playing lately. And I've got Kansas State right there. Their only win, the problem for Kansas State is their only win is over TCU. That's a 4-4 team. And the committee does, in the past, they have given some credit for wins over 500 teams. So all you got to do is be a 500 team, and you're going to get at least a little bit of credit. That's why Clemson was always ranked as high as they were. The committee would talk about, well, they had wins over 5, 6, and 6 teams or whatever, 5 bowl eligible teams. So I think the committee will give a little bit of credit there, but it's not going to be a whole lot. And then you look at their losses. Missouri, that's a good loss, and then Oklahoma State, a team that's going to be just outside the top 25. So there's not a whole lot there for Kansas State. Really, no team deserves to be ranked 25th, honestly. But the Wildcats there at 25. Air Force and James Madison, I think, will be just ahead of them. They could be flipped. You got James Madison with a win over a 2-loss Georgia Southern. Air Force with a win over a 3-loss Wyoming. That's really the only good wins for these two teams. I think the committee, even though they have 3 losses, is going to view the Wyoming win a little bit better than Georgia Southern. I think that's why you see Air Force just ahead of James Madison. And then UCLA and USC ahead of them. Comparing these two teams, you got both teams have lost to good teams. UCLA lost to Utah and Oregon State. USC lost to Notre Dame and Utah. So both teams have pretty similar losses there. You look at USC wins over Arizona, pretty good win, okay win. Colorado, UCLA with wins over Washington State and Colorado. And so again, it's very close with those two teams. I'm going with UCLA just because I think they have passed the eye test a little bit better than USC. And with this committee, how much is that going to matter? How much is it going to be about resume? How much is it going to be about eye test? We just don't know until we get these first rankings. But usually after you get the first rankings, you can kind of tell what each committee is valuing the most, and then usually it's pretty easy to project these. First one's always tough, though. So we'll see. 16 through 20 here, I've got Tennessee at number 20. Vols are 6-2. You look at their resume. Bama, they lose that game. That's not going to hurt them too much. Florida, though, a 3-loss team now. Wins over Texas A&M and Kentucky. UTSA, maybe give them a little credit for that win. But not a whole lot there on the resume for Tennessee. Kansas ahead of them because of the big win over Oklahoma. I mean, that's the difference here. That is a huge win. They also beat a 5-3 BYU team. Losses came to a top 10 Texas team and Oklahoma State team that is just outside the top 25. That's a little bit of a better loss than Florida if you want to really nitpick here. And then also losing to Texas a little bit better than losing to Alabama. So it's very close with those two teams. Oregon State just ahead of them. You look at Oregon State, the losses are what hurt them. They have wins over Utah and UCLA, 2 really good wins, but they have a loss to a 4-4 Washington State and then a loss to a 5-3 Arizona. That's what's hurting Oregon State. So even though they have the head-to-head over Utah, I've actually got them a couple spots below them just because of the resumes. And then Tulane is an interesting team here. Their only loss is to Ole Miss, who you're going to see actually in the top 10 in just a few moments. And they have a win over a 2-loss Memphis team. Memphis's only other loss is to Missouri, so Memphis a pretty good win. I think that win will be enough. And then again, the fact that you lose to a top 10 team in a close game, I think that's enough to get Tulane actually ranked pretty high. And then ahead of them is Utah. You look at their 2 losses, Oregon and Oregon State. Those are very good losses, and they have wins over UCLA, USC, and a 3-loss Florida team, which is a pretty good win as well. So Utah has a pretty good resume. I know eye test wise, they probably should not be ranked this high, but if we're going by resume, and I think that's what the committee is going to look at the most here for these first rankings, I think Utah actually does wind up there at 16 ahead of Oregon State. All right, 11 through 15. I've got Notre Dame at number 15. For Notre Dame, the losses are good. They have good losses here. Ohio State and Louisville, definitely good losses. USC is a good win, a 2-loss team. NC State and Duke are 3-loss teams, so they have some pretty good wins there. Louisville, what's hurting them is their loss to Pitt. I mean, they have a really bad loss. This is one of the worst losses for any team in the top 25. But they have put together some pretty good wins. I mean, they've got a win over a 2-loss Notre Dame. They've got wins over 3-loss teams in Duke, Boston College, NC State, and then also a decent Georgia Tech team. I think the committee's going to give them some credit for that, and only having 1 loss, even though it's a bad loss, I think head-to-head as well, it does put Louisville ahead of Notre Dame here in this scenario. If Louisville had 2 losses, I think head-to-head wouldn't matter. I think Notre Dame would be ahead of them. But with only 1 loss, I think they will be ahead of the Irish. Missouri ahead of them, 1 loss coming to LSU. That's a good team to lose to. They have wins over Kansas State, who again may be ranked, a 2-loss Memphis team, a pretty good win there, and then also a 3-loss Kentucky team. So no signature win for Missouri, but they have put together some pretty solid wins, and I think that puts them up here in this spot. LSU ahead of them, really mostly because of the losses. You lose to Florida State, you lose on the road at Ole Miss. These are top 10 teams. Those are really good losses. They have a win over this 1-loss Missouri team that's just behind them. And then not going to get much credit, but probably a little bit of credit for wins, I should say, over Auburn and Mississippi State. Both those teams 4-4. Not great teams, but again, the committee does, I think, give a little bit of credit for those types of wins. And then Oklahoma ahead of them. I think you look at these top teams, and Oklahoma, to me, is clearly going to be at the bottom of the other 1-loss teams. You know, talking about Alabama, Ole Miss, Oregon, Texas, Penn State, all those teams. I think Oklahoma is going to be behind them because the teams ahead of them all lost to really top 10 teams, top 12 teams or whatever. Oklahoma lost to Kansas, who should be ranked, again, and pretty high, but I think that loss is what's going to hurt them. They have a great win over Texas. That's a really, really good win. But other than that, they have not much. SMU, a pretty good 2-loss Group of 5 team. Then Iowa State, who's been a bit of a surprise, only a 3-loss team. But that's it. I mean, not a lot of good wins piled up there for Oklahoma, even though they have the really good one over Texas. But again, it comes down to the loss. And sometimes the committee seems to really look at the losses. Sometimes, you know, there's been years where it didn't seem to matter who you lost to. It was just about who you beat. And we'll find out. If Oklahoma's ranked a lot higher, then I think that tells us the committee. And Louisville. If Louisville's ranked higher, that tells us the committee doesn't care as much about who you lose to. It's more about who you beat. And we will find that out again tomorrow night. All right, top 10 now. Texas, Alabama, Oregon, Ole Miss, Penn State. I was actually surprised when this is how the projection came out. Not really what I was expecting, but when you really dig in and look at the resumes, this is what I feel like it's going to look like. I feel pretty confident, actually, on these teams, 6 through 10. This is an area where I feel pretty confident. All of these teams losing again to good teams: Texas to Oklahoma, Alabama to Texas, Oregon to Washington, Ole Miss to Alabama, Penn State to Ohio State. So all of them have really good losses. I think they're pretty even in that regard. Then it just comes down to the wins. And for Texas, you have a really good win over Alabama. Alabama has a really good win over Ole Miss. Those are your 2 best wins. They've also put together wins behind that. Texas beat Kansas. BYU, Wyoming is a pretty good win. Alabama has wins over Tennessee, Texas A&M, and even Mississippi State. So I feel very confident that these teams are here. Texas, head-to-head, definitely going to be ahead of Alabama in my opinion. And so we'll see Texas and Alabama there at 6 and 7. And then Oregon, they have a win over Utah, a really good win there. You look at Ole Miss, they have a really good win over LSU. Also, the win over Tulane. And if the committee really values that Tulane game, you could even possibly see Ole Miss ranked ahead of Oregon. That would not shock me. Penn State wins over Iowa and West Virginia. Not great, but again, their loss was a little bit better than Oklahoma's, and that's why I think they're going to be ahead of Oklahoma. Perhaps those teams could be switched. Both resumes pretty similar, but Oklahoma does have the good win, the really good win over Texas. So we'll see how those teams rank again. I feel really confident on 6, 7, and really 8 and 9 as well. Penn State, Oklahoma possibly flip. We'll just have to see what the committee does there. So let's get into the top 5 now. We'll start at number 5. That's Washington. Washington has a pretty good resume at the top. You know, they've got the one over Oregon, I should say. But the committee in the past, it's not just about, and I think people get so hung up on those wins, and they'll say, well, this team beat a 1-loss team, and this team, their best wins over a 2-loss team. Well, what do they have behind that? What do they have on the resume behind that one really good win? Well, for Washington, not much. They have Arizona. That's their only other decent win. And so I think that's what's going to hurt them a little bit. Also, playing in some close games. Some very close games against some pretty bad teams. I think that's why Washington winds up at number 5, even though they do have the really good win over Oregon. Number 4 is Georgia, and I know people are going to be shocked if this does happen, and I'm sure there are going to be plenty of comments saying that I'm crazy here, and I do feel pretty confident that Georgia is going to be at number 4. It's just there's nothing there on the resume. They've got wins over Florida, Kentucky, Auburn. That's their best wins. So 2 3-loss teams and a 4-4 Auburn team. That is it. They haven't been overly impressive in some of these games. Now, their best performances were against Florida and Kentucky, so that helps having, you know, blowout wins over those teams. But against lesser competition, they haven't looked as dominant. The committee might go by, you know, what a lot of people are doing here and say, well, they were the defending national champs. They've won the last 2 years. I'm putting them at number 1 until they lose. I don't think the committee is going to do that. They could. I could be wrong here, but I think Georgia is going to be at 4. And I feel pretty confident. Honestly, I feel pretty confident at Washington at 5 for sure. And I feel fairly confident with Georgia at number 4. 1 through 3, I feel good about 1. 2 and 3, I'm not sure. We'll see. And really 2 through 4, I could see them changing this up a little bit. But I'm going with Florida State at number 3. You look at the resume for them. They have a really good win over LSU. And they've put together a lot of wins over 3 and 4 win teams. Again, these are not great wins, but the committee in the past has valued these types of wins. We're talking Boston College, Duke, 2 3-loss teams. Then some 4 and 4 teams, Clemson, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, Wake Forest. Again, none of these are great wins, and if the committee is not going to value those wins as much, maybe they're behind Georgia, but again, they still have that win over LSU, which is a better win than anything Georgia has. So I think Florida State will be at number 3. And then number 2, I'm going with Michigan. So the resume is not great for Michigan. It's maybe better than you might think, though. They haven't won over a 2-loss Rutgers team, pretty good Group of 5 team in UNLV. And then Nebraska and Wisconsin, those are 3-loss teams. And so I think the committee will give them a little bit of credit for these wins, but it's just going to be about the performance, the way they have dominated. They've been the most dominant team all year, and that's pretty clear. So how much do they penalize them for not having a good signature win? Well, again, Georgia doesn't have one. Florida State only has the win over LSU. Maybe Michigan does drop to 3 or 4, but I think the eye test is going to put them at number 2, and that means our number 1 team. And I feel really confident that this will be the number 1 team. I think it's going to be Ohio State. Their resume is just so much better than everyone else's here at the top. They have a win over a 1-loss Penn State team. They have a win over a 2-loss Notre Dame team. So you're talking about 2 really good wins there. And then wins over Maryland and Wisconsin. Those are 3-win teams, or 3-loss teams, I should say. So those are decent wins as well. Though, you know, if you took Penn State and Notre Dame out of the equation, Ohio State would have a similar resume to Michigan, Georgia, and even maybe Florida State. Obviously, the LSU game is big. But again, the resume wouldn't be that much behind. And then you throw in Notre Dame and Penn State, which are better wins than maybe anyone else in the top 5 has. I think it's clear. I think Ohio State will be number 1 unless they just don't look at resume and they go only by eye test and they decide, you know, Michigan's been the most dominant team, or they decide, look, Georgia's the 2-time defending national champs. We're putting them at number 1. I don't think they're going to do that. That's not what they're supposed to do. So this is what I think it's going to look like. So this is your top 5. Again, I feel confident with Ohio State at 1. I feel pretty confident with Washington at 5. 2 through 4, maybe those are a little bit different. We'll see. It's going to be interesting. Very first rankings coming out, and we'll learn a lot from those first rankings. So give me your reaction to my projections. Maybe give me your projections down in the comments below.